Hello, welcome to this week's CleaveTech Tech Tip. Now, you've probably guessed what this video is all about from the title of the video, and you're probably also thinking maybe I've gone a little bit over the top with what you can see in the video now, and I think you're probably right. But today's tech tip is all about adding weight to your slot car and how it can affect the way it handles. So I think this much lead sort of overdoes it a little bit and might not actually help in any way, shape or form. So I'm going to remove that amount of lead. We're going to talk about where you can put small amounts of this stuff to help the handling of your chassis. So I'm going to start by basing some of what I'm talking about on one of these production cars, this 1/24th production car. This is a Mercedes Patriot Defender, I believe. It's an all steel version. It's not got aluminium pans. It's all got thick pans, etc. That's sort of what we can run on flat tracks here in the UK and on club tracks. They're absolutely bulletproof. They're great. You can thrash them around week in, week out, and you don't really bend anything at all. They're very reliable. A great chassis for that purpose. So I also know that a lot of my viewers in America also use these chassis on their bank tracks. Probably weighting is a little different on a bank track, but at least you'll get some idea maybe of how to set one of these things up for some of the different tracks you come across. So I've mentioned that this is a Mercedes Defender chassis. Well, I have actually got a video of how I built the JK C43 chassis, which is in the similar class to this. So if you haven't seen that video, have a look up here now and have a look. I've got a whole series of videos that take you through all the way from the start of the chassis right through to finishing the chassis off, putting everything on and getting it pretty much race ready. So there's a whole series and a playlist involved in building the C43 chassis. So take a look at that. Now, one of the most common places that I see lead added is right behind the guide tab here. Now, this is talking about chassis in general, not just this chassis. So you can apply this to other chassis as well, like the C43, or maybe even if you use some open type chassis. I'll be doing a separate video on plastic car chassis such as NSR and slot.it and the weighting of those, because they work in a slightly different way because they have a different sort of motor pod to them, and that affects the handling in a slightly different way. But again, some of what I'm saying is still relevant to those cars in terms of the feel you might get for that car. So this is one of the most common places that I see people add some weight. Now, they might cut the weight nicely to sort of go behind the guide tab and sit here. Now, what effect is that going to have on the car? Well, it's quite close to the pivot point of the car. So if you can imagine, the car is pivoting around this guide point here as it enters corners. So that weight's not far away. It's quite close to that pivot point, and it's quite far towards the nose of the car. So you get a much more forward weight bias to the car. Now, people think, oh yeah, that'll really help me turn into corners. I'm falling out going into corners, so I'll put some lead there. But no, that doesn't really help it. The lead there helps more on an exit to a corner if you are popping the front. But it only helps if you're popping the front due to too much grip probably at the back. It doesn't help if you're popping the front because the front is sliding around like this and going totally sideways, hitting the guide stop and then ripping out the guide out of the slot. It will help slightly with that because obviously the car is heavier at the front end, so it's harder to get the guide out of the slot. But really, it's for if you're putting the power down, coming out corners, and you're finding that the front is just popping. So maybe on really sharp corners, really tight corners, you're finding you're getting sort of 3/4 away around the corner, wanting to start to put some power on, and the front just pops out the slot like that. Then putting some lead at the front of your car can help with that issue. So another popular place where people put lead is at the rear of the pans. So maybe there and there, sort of right at the back of the pans. Now, when you start putting lead on a part of the chassis that can in effect move, now I know this chassis is taped up, so putting lead here has a slightly different effect when the chassis is taped than when it's not taped. Let's say the chassis wasn't taped and this pan section can wobble forwards and backwards and left and right quite a bit. Then putting lead here, that's quite a long way from the pivot of the chassis. So as the car enters a corner and goes to slide, that lead is quite a long way from this pivot point here, acting just in front of the rear tyres. So what happens when you brake for a corner and the pans shift slightly forward like this, and then you start to turn into the corner, the pans will move slightly outwards like that, and so does this weight. So initially the weight makes it ever so slightly harder for the pans to move, because obviously you need slightly more force to shift more mass, but the pans will then move, and that mass then has slightly more momentum than it would do if it didn't have the weight on it, and it will kick the back out a little bit more on corner entry. So what that will do is if the car's kicking out like this on corner entry, it gets the back moving around a little bit more and perhaps stops the front from popping. I suppose similar idea to this, but the weight behind the guide tends to stop it from popping more on the exit of corners. This weight here with movable pans can make the back start to move nicely going into corners, and even through S's. Where you're changing direction through S's and you want the back to move nicely, then having movable pans, sloppy pans like this, or not like this, sorry, not taped, but having sloppy pans and weight at the back can help the back end move around S's quite nicely. So sticking with the movable pans, with the weight at the rear, what can happen is when you start to put your trigger on the accelerator and you start to accelerate, the pans will move back on the chassis. So the weight transfer is then towards the rear when you get onto power again. That moves the weight slightly further rearwards, adds a little bit more grip to the rear of the car as that pushes forwards on the rear of the car. So weight at the rear will then help you get out of the corners without sliding as much. So although the weight at the rear of a corner helps the chassis move a little bit more initially going in, then when you get the weight transfer coming back, it can help reduce that moving around and steady the back of the car on the exit of a corner. But what about if the pans are all fixed, like in this case here? So these pans here, they don't really move much. You can see that they're pretty rigid via this gel tape that I've got on the chassis. So really the whole thing is just sort of acting as a bit of a dampener between the two chassis parts and the body, etc. I've even got floating body mounts on this chassis as well. So what happens when you've got rear at the pans when the pans don't really move? Well, when the weight is here, it doesn't really help with any sort of weight transfer in corners. So it doesn't shift forward when you brake, it doesn't shift backwards when you accelerate, it doesn't shift side to side going around corners. It really just adds weight towards the outside rear of the car. So in this case, it just generally can add a little bit more grip to the rear of the car in general. And as I've said before, the weight being a long way away from the pivot means that it's initially harder to make the car move. So because you have to have a little bit more force to move the extra mass of the car slightly. And you've got a little bit more weight pushing down on the rear tyres, giving you slightly more grip anyway on the rear tyres. So weight at the rear of the chassis without movable pans can, say, give you slightly more grip, both in, around, and coming out of the corners. So thinking about it, a lot of people think, oh yeah, let's put some weight at the front of the car here to help it through sort of some S's on the track. Well, actually, weight at the front doesn't generally tend to help through S's. Weight here tends to make the car get sort of all crossed up through S's, because the front's trying to stay in and the back's moving around like this, and it gets in a hell of a mess through S's. Actually, weighting the rear of the car like this towards the rear of the pans can actually help the car go through S's much more smoothly. So if your track has some sort of sweeping S's or even some quite tight S's, weighting the rear of the car might help you get through those S's a little bit better. So where else might you put weight on the chassis? Well, you could put it here, which is just in front of the motor here, which is sort of just behind really the crossbar or the bite bar of the chassis here. So what does the weight do when it's in this position? Well, in this position here, it's probably just a fraction rear of the centre of gravity of the car, but not by much. So weighting it here tends to settle the whole car down and makes the car a little bit less lively. So if you're feeling your car sort of a little bit unpredictable, a little bit sort of, well, perhaps not unpredictable, but a little bit lively, maybe you're not quite sure what it's doing, it's sort of popping out here, there, you're maybe not comfortable with transitions between sweepy corners, tight corners, etc., then putting a little bit of lead here in towards the centre of your car can help dampen the whole thing down and just sort of helps keep it in the slot a little bit. It helps a little bit with a bit of extra grip as well when it's slightly rearwards of the centre of the car on the centre section. So remember, this is on the piece of the chassis that's perhaps not moving much. If you've got a solid piece between the guide and the motor and the back axle, even if your guide is a floaty guide, if your chassis hasn't got too much twist, then adding weight here can generally, as I say, dampen the whole thing down, make the car less lively, help it perhaps with a change of direction, because it generally doesn't really affect the change of direction much because it's in the centre of rotation, or sorry, the centre of gravity of the car. Although it is a little bit far away from the pivot, it's not moving at all, and it's, as I say, it's not changing the balance of the car front to rear very much. So it can help a little bit with change direction in that it weights the whole car down and, as I say, makes it just less lively. So what about moving it from there? And I've also seen people put some weight here, sort of under the back axle. Well, that's much further again from the centre of rotation and much further rear of the centre of gravity of the car. And this basically puts all your mass and all your weight sort of under the rear axle and onto those rear tyres. So it can give you a lot more initial grip of the car. So it's much harder to move the back of the car out on cornering. The only issue with weight here is when the car starts to move, it can move with much more sort of ferocity, in the fact that when you've overcome that grip, there is then a lot more mass that's now starting to move and slide, and it can send it wildly sort of off sideways, and it can tend to sort of launch the car. But it does definitely give you much more grip initially of the car by putting the weight rearwards. And I've seen the retro guys that have sort of inline motors that run sort of the Can-Am and the UKRRA or the USRRA, I think it's called, something like that, that run the retro cars. Running some weight here towards the back can give the car a lot more grip. And this is something I'll be doing on that slot stocks on my other video that you might have seen. So have a look up there, have a look at the slot stocks I've been rebuilding, and you can see how I've got so far with that. And I'm going to be doing another video on weighting that slot stocks up after you've seen some of the theory in this video here. Well, one of the last places I'd advise you try some weight, again, maybe not quite this much, I've only just got these little squares just to show you sort of roughly where to put weight, but you could put weight towards the front of the pans like that, on the outside front of the pans. Perhaps maybe not on a production car like this, although you could put some thinner lead there and try it out, or maybe just on these bits here inside the front axle mounts and give that a go. So you could try and put some lead there. Now, what effect does that actually have? Well, the weight there, it's not too far from the centre of rotation, but it is slightly further forward of the centre of gravity of the car. But it is far on the outside of the car. Now, what this tends to do is help you through big, long, sweepy corners. If you feel you haven't got the confidence in the car to get round a big, long sweeper, if you're finding that either you're getting halfway round, the car sort of pops out a little bit, or if you're sort of getting somewhere near going to put the power on again, or you're feeling you're wanting to put the power on but you can't quite power it, instead of putting the lead right behind the guide, try some smaller bits on the outside front of the pans, and it generally just helps settle the front of the car down and keeps the front of the car much more planted in the slot. Yes, it will move slightly more at the rear because you've moved the weight balance slightly forward of the centre of gravity that you had before, but it will help nail the front of the car. So in this video, I've tried to give you some idea of what happens when you put lead in different places of your car. Obviously, you can change the amounts of lead, and that will affect the overall effectiveness of what you're doing. So remember, there's lead behind the guide, there's lead at the back of both pans. That acts differently depending on whether you've taped the pans or you have moving pans. There's lead just in front of the motor on the centre section, lead behind the motor on the centre section, and lead on the front of the pans here and here. Again, this behaves ever so slightly differently depending on how much float and movement you've got in your pans as well, but it doesn't affect it quite so much as when you've got the lead at the back with floating or taped or damped pans. Now, you've got to appreciate these are my findings. This is the way I drive, this is the way I set up cars, this is what I've found out from my experimentation and driving that I do, mostly on quite large flat tracks, but also on some tight twisty 4-lane club tracks as well. And I've raced on ISRA style flat tracks, which are quite fast and sweepy as well. But again, this is my opinion of that, but I'm trying to give you an idea of things that you can try on your own car on a track that you're comfortable driving with. It obviously depends again on tyre compound. You could have lead in a particular place and think, well, that's nice, change a set of tyres and the car handles totally differently again. So it's about setting it up the way you like it. It also depends on compromise of the track. If the track has got some S's that you need to be really fast through to get a good lap time, then maybe you need to consider setting your car up for those S's rather than perhaps some of the easier corners, which are just sort of brake and squirt type corners, or maybe they're flat out type corners. So again, it's compromising for the type of track that you might be racing on. Sometimes you get tracks that have some really fast bits and some really slow bits, and you can make your car work through the slow bits but not be so good through the fast, and vice versa. But again, it's compromising and finding what works for you. Are you better off having a car that works through the tight twisty bits and is maybe not quite so quick on the fast bits, or the other way round? Think about Formula One, for example, how different cars and different teams perform differently on different tracks. The way they've designed their car and the way they've compromised things like downforce, straight line speed, handling, tyre warm-up, etc., they all affect how they perform at different temperatures on different tracks, etc. So the same thing applies to slot racing. But again, sticking a body on this that has big wing dams or air dams on it, again, will change weighting, and probably you can reduce weight from a chassis and make it much lighter when you're relying purely on downforce on the chassis. So again, body type can also depend on how you set these cars up as well. Changing the body slightly means that you might again run totally different sort of weight combination on your chassis than you would do if you had a saloon type shell or a sedan type shell on the car. So have a play, have a go with the car, weight it up differently. Let me know your findings. If you've got one of these, or you've got a C43 chassis, or a Palmer 24th car, or something like that you've been running around, let me know in the comments below how your car handles and where you like the weight and what you've found out with your car. Be really interested to find out. Also, hit the thumbs up button down below like that so you like the video. That will make sure that other people get to see the video that might be into slot cars as well, and will help them with their setting up their cars. And if you've liked these videos, you can actually add me a thank you down there by pressing the thank you button, and you can contribute a little bit towards what I'm doing here. I'm offering pretty much all these tips for free at the moment to everybody, and I've been doing so for well over a year now. So if you do love my videos and want to contribute a little bit to help me carry on with this stuff, maybe to have some parts, review some parts, etc., then if you can hit the thank you button down there and give me a little contribution, it would be much appreciated. But apart from that, if it's the first video you've seen, you haven't subscribed, hit the big C, have a look at my other videos. I'm sure you'll love what you can see. But thanks once again for watching, and next week we'll be probably going to be going back to the slot stocks and weighting up the slot stocks using some of the theory we've learnt in this video. See you then. Bye.